Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So Kaley and I, as we were preparing for this talk, we basically each prepared a paper. And I'm going to be providing an overview of a text by Lenin called State and Revolution, seen through the eyes of not only Lenin, the author of it, but also through Jean Molyneux, whose book really formed the basis of this talk. And it asked the singular question, what's the relevance in the 21st century? So my portion of it is going to be quite abstract, theoretical, but it's going to lay the groundwork, I hope, for the more tangible, and I don't want to put too much pressure on you, Kaley, but the more tangible and concrete sort of directions that we can take from the text, State and Revolution. So I will just also say that it was great fun reading this book. Jean Molyneux, as I didn't know, but it came to realize as I was reading it, was effectively a teacher during his life. I think he passed away a few years ago. And the reason I keep looking at you, Spencer, is because you just told me that you were also took a chapter from this book. But he was a teacher, and as a result, it's quite an accessible book to read it. And as I was reading State and Revolution on the internet, on Marxist.org, it really helped kind of put that in context, because writing changes as the decades go. And then I watched a few videos and all that, and this is kind of a summation of what I think we can take out of it. So if you don't mind, I'm going to go back to my graduate student days. I'm just going to read my text as a seminar, and I look forward to having questions afterwards. Okay, so the first part is, what is the context of this book? So what is Lenin's book, State and Revolution, about? It is his argument with other revolutionary socialists within the European left in general, and German socialists in particular, on the concept of the state. And he began writing this while in exile in 1916, and the book was published in 1917. So allow me to take you back 108 years ago to 1916, okay? The First World War is in full swing, and throughout Europe, revolutionary socialist political parties are at their height, not only having significant numbers of seats throughout European parliaments, but also having massive memberships on the streets and shop floors throughout Europe. They are agitating for civil and workers' rights, fending off police violence, and strategizing cross-nationally to entrench these gains. However, there's a poison pill in the mix, and it's in the Second International. This is the association which brings socialist parties from all over the world together. And it has been fatally fractured because nearly every socialist party has come out in support of their respective country waging war. Just 3 years prior, these socialist parties had been fervently anti-war and completely internationalist. They were in agreement that Europe was engaged in inter-imperialist rivalry. They were in agreement that Europe's bourgeoisie, who after colonizing the entire world had begun to overtly take from one another each other's colonial possessions for the redivision of the world, for the redivision of the colonies, the semi-peripheral colonies, and to create new spheres of markets and influence. Socialists the world over vowed not to kill workers in other countries at the behest of elites in their own nations. They rejected the idea that nationality is the uniting identity for people, and reaffirmed that it is people's lived experiences as workers which form their identity. And yet, once the war started, most socialist revolutionaries capitulate and support it. So Lenin begins this exploration of how could it be that this worldwide, very powerful socialist movement would capitulate and give up all their principles when the war starts. He begins a deeper examination to sort out what the source of this capitulation could be. Because it wasn't just the German revolutionary socialists, and it wasn't just the French socialists. It was largely everyone on the left, with some notable exceptions, the Bolsheviks, Serbians, and Americans. And to Lenin, it looks like the end of Marxism. And this is the disappointment that motivates him to examine what the socialist, the Marxist view of the state is. And through this exercise, Lenin is able to better understand the current of capitulation, reformism, and opportunism, which marked the debacle of the revolutionaries supporting war on one another effectively. Mind you, it's late 1916. Lenin is in exile in Switzerland. This is a full calendar year, completely unknown to him, before he becomes the head of state of the new revolutionary socialist Russia. So just to highlight, it is not in anticipation of the Russian Revolution when he begins this study of Marxist concept of the state. He simply got time on his hands and is trying to make sense of the roots of the fracture in the Second International. And in studying and making sense of Marx's works, Lenin reaches the conclusion, this is the conclusion, that revolutionaries cannot take hold of the already existing state and use it for socialist purposes. Instead, revolutionaries have to, quote, smash the old bureaucratic machine at once and to begin immediately to construct a new one that will make possible a gradual abolition of all bureaucracy. This is not a utopia, he writes. It is the experience of the commune, the direct and immediate task of the revolutionary proletariat. The commune he's referring to is the Paris Commune, the example Marx analyzed to locate what the transition from capitalism to communism requires. And State and Revolution is published in 1917, but remains sort of unfinished because a revolution breaks out in Russia, and Lenin shuttles back to take part. And as a result, Lenin is unable to incorporate the lessons of the 1917 revolution, which would have provided more insight on the question of the state. Now, 108 years ago is a hell of a long time back, and especially a hell of a long time back to be thinking about the relevance of an argument. That said, and even though the economic, social, and political realities of the time are so different from where we are today, since the publication of this book, there have been so many examples which confirm Lenin's argument that socialism will atrophy and deaden if the state is not smashed and reconstructed once it has been won, including and foremost the example of what happened to the Russian Revolution itself. So let's get to first principles. What is the state? Marx and Engels see the state not as the government or the various forms of governmental rule. They see the essence of the state as instruments of coercion and repression in society. As Lenin puts it, the state is, in its essence, special bodies of armed men, meaning it's the military, the police, the courts, and the prisons, each of which operate in rigid hierarchies and create social relations which replicate these hierarchies. It's the legislature, the judiciary, the military, and the vast bureaucratic apparatus which underpins all of this. But to what end? The end is the state operates in the interest of the ruling class minority. First principles. It is not a mediator of differences between classes. It is the instrument of one class, the ruling class, that is, the dictatorship of the ruling class over the working class. To quote Marx from the Communist Manifesto, the executive of the modern state is nothing but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. In other words, the existence of a state is an expression of the irreconcilability of ruling and working classes, where the minority ruling capital class requires the means to subjugate the majority working class. This subjugation is not only physical, but also, and perhaps even more critically, ideological and consensual. That is, it forms the basis of how we relate to one another, and it guides our social interactions. As I said at the start of this talk, Lenin is arguing with other social democrats, with other social democrats and socialists who very much consider themselves Marxists. And they believe that these instruments of power, the legislature, military, judiciary, and bureaucracies, can be taken over and reformed to serve ordinary people and establish socialist social relations. State and Revolution is a polemic against this idea, this tactic, and it was written by Lenin to center Marx and Engels' own writings about what the state is and to locate, to find where it is socialists have concluded that reforming the state without smashing it can lead to socialist social relations. To quote Marx from the German ideology, between capitalist and communist society lies the period of revolutionary transformation of the one into the other. Corresponding to this is also a political transition period in which the state can be nothing but the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. As an aside, the phrase dictatorship of the proletariat, what it means is that the state operates in the interests of the working class majority over the interests of the capitalist class minority. It's the inversion of that first principle, the inversion of the state operating in the interests of the minority class over the majority working class. But going back to this quote, the line specifically, the period of revolutionary transformation. Lenin's argument is that for reformists, it is the space constituting the period of revolutionary transformation, where an opening is created for reformists to believe that an accommodation government can transform capitalism into communism, thereby reconciling class antagonisms. Lenin disagreed fundamentally with this idea and argued if it was possible to reconcile the classes, then you wouldn't need a state to begin with. Because if you conceptualize the state as something that has neutral tendencies, you don't really understand it as a creation of the ruling class to be the instrument by which the working class can be suppressed. Another side comment here is on the question of how it is the ruling class got a hold of these coercive organs in the first place. And Marx sees them emerge as outcomes of the capitalist ruling class's own revolutions against the monarchies of the day, the feudal aristocracies. And in the process, these instruments are created and are perfected in application. In fact, you can say, in their own revolutions against monarchies and feudal aristocracies, did the capitalist class successfully smash the old bureaucratic machine and begin to immediately construct a new one. Going back to Lenin's concept of the state, that is, the state is constituted of special bodies of armed men, police, military, judiciary, etc., that have coercion and prisons at their disposal and are backed up by a layer of bureaucracy and civil service. When we see the state in this way, we can see why it is that the closer people get to taking state power, be it through civil rights and workers' campaigns, elections, etc., the more likely it is the instruments of the state will come down upon them. Military, police, violence. I couldn't help myself but bring a prop, and it's a prop of our good friend and quite frankly a hero, Jeremy Corbyn, and the work that the Labour Party did internally, what he and his comrades had to do to get to the heights of the Labour Party. And you can just see what happened in those years, in those what was it, like 4 or 5 years where there was all this activity happening in the UK around the Labour Party. You could see the bureaucracies turning on Corbyn. You could see the media turning on Corbyn. This is Lenin's point, that even when you capture it, if you're not able to transform it, it will turn on you and it will eat you. But I had to bring it because it's been sitting in my box in a box in my basement for the last 6 years, and it used to be on the back of my car, actually, and I just used to have it, and I used to drive around the city with this thing in the back. But yeah. So again, history is replete with examples. The repressive power of the state gets mobilized in defense of the ruling class anytime its institutions are threatened. And not only that, but Lenin also argues it's wishful thinking to take parliamentary power as the main vehicle to do so, because the business of the state occurs through its organs, the bureaucracies, the departments, the forces, which Parliament actually doesn't have very much control over. In the interest of time, I'm going to take out a section. I'm going to go to my conclusion here. On the face of it, this is a very gloomy outlook. It really only leaves two alternatives. One, we follow a reformist path and get sucked into the state apparatus, be it through piecemeal, important piecemeal and incremental changes, but that don't really threaten the social relations of the capitalist state. Or two, we engage in a struggle which will surely invite the immense repressive power of the state. Neither option seems very fun. And with that, I'll turn it over to my co-presenter, Kaley, who will concretize how it is we can navigate this dilemma.
Awesome. Thanks, Faiz, and I'll do my best to get us out of the gloom. But, you know, this is about having an honest and sober assessment of kind of what we're up against. So, kind of now that we understand the context in which Lenin was writing State and Revolution and what Lenin is saying about the state and whether it can be reformed in the interest of working people, I want to turn a bit to what this means for our organizing. And first I want to say that the question of the state is central to understanding our work as revolutionary socialists. And Lenin says this in a 1917 article in Pravda: the basic question of every revolution is that of state power. Unless this question is understood, there can be no intelligent participation in the revolution, not to speak of guidance of the revolution. And so, as Faiz touched on, in the past 100 plus years, there have been ample examples of how a failure to understand the question of the state in the context of uprisings and revolutions has left the promise of a society that works in the interests of the masses unfulfilled. And I think that the Corbyn example is good. You know, there's when Corbyn was looking like he could take state power, there was a military, officials in the military came out and said, we will defy him. We won't, even if he's the prime minister and he tries to reduce spending in the military or tries to dismantle elements of the military, we'll just commit treason. And, they were just openly, like they were, anonymously, but just saying that in the media. So we can see kind of that happening. So Lenin's analysis of the state can help us understand not only what the state is and who it serves, but also help us navigate questions we face as revolutionary socialists engaged in struggle outside of revolutionary moments. So as Faiz explained, the state is a coercive institution made up of armed special bodies of men, and its object is to be a vehicle for the ruling class's oppression of the working class. And as we've talked about, the history has shown that this essential nature of the state means it can't be just simply taken over and reformed to act in the interest of the working class. And I think this question is very much alive amongst the left and within movements we organize with. There are many elements of the left who believe that if we get access to state power through elections, we can reform the state and we can bring a socialist society. And I'm sorry to say, but there are no shortcuts to revolution. And the true core of the state will resist any action any actions that represent an actual threat to capitalism. And we don't have time today to talk about this, but like this is also what we've seen in Greece, in certain revolutions in South America. I'll talk a little bit about Sudan. It's a struggle that's happening right now with the activists in Bangladesh. Like, you know, it's very much something that we see. So as a result, socialist transformation can't simply be a project of electoral politics, wherein we elect socialist politicians who then instigate socialist revolution. What we actually need is a revolution from workers themselves. And a workers' revolution is the only context that create the conditions for smashing or dismantling the current capitalist state in order for a new social order to take hold. So I just want to talk a little bit about the conditions that give rise to revolution. And I just want to say that revolutions don't happen because workers just become alive to revolutionary ideas. That, as John Milne explains, quote, revolutions occur when mass struggles break out over concrete and immediate demands, and these struggles overflow the bounds of normal politics. They bring the masses onto the stage of history, and in the process, these masses get a sense of their collective power. And I want to stress here that when we're talking, like what we're talking about is not a few hundred people or a few thousand people or even 10 or 20 or 80,000 people. We're talking about millions of people. We're talking about like the masses that we're talking about is something that, you know, I haven't seen in my life, but I hope to see. And this is important because like that's the kind of collective power that emerges in mass revolution is in direct opposition to the lack of collective power that people feel under the capitalist state. And before we kind of get doom and gloom about that, I think that what I'll talk about is that our organizing has to give people opportunities to have a taste of that collective power, even if we're not seeing it in the kind of context of millions of people rising up against the state. Anne Alexander, who is a socialist who has written a lot on Sudan, says it isn't enough for people to be angry, frustrated, or miserable. They have to start taking action and try to change things for themselves, not simply wait passively for someone else to do it for them. So I think that those, you know, that's something to keep in mind as we continue this talk and this discussion. So if we understand that the state can't be reformed and we need a workers' revolution to like have true social transformation, then does that mean that we just abandon attempts for state reforms and like abandon any engagement with electoral politics? And my answer is no. I think that approach is a losing strategy, and I'll talk a little bit about why. But I think what we're trying to do here is have a sober and honest understanding of the limits of the state and what is actually required for true social transformation to build the kind of world we believe in, that is one in which society works in the interest of all and is under the direction of workers themselves. But so this kind of sober understanding can help us help ensure we stay oriented to that goal, to prepare and organize it for a working class uprising which would destroy the existing state apparatus, including its parliament, and replace it with a social order based on workers' control and structured around radically different power relations between people. And Faiz mentioned the Paris Commune, and Lenin and Marx both talk about some of the elements that those different social relations would look like, you know, that we saw in the Paris Commune, that we saw in the Soviets or workers' councils in the context of the Russian Revolution, and includes things like democratic elections, but also instant recallability, so that you can, you know, be like, actually, you're not doing what you said you do, now we're taking back our support. And also kind of considering people who are doing representative work, they're also the people that have to implement the decisions that are made, and that they're considered as doing kind of special service as workers, which means that they're paid and treated like average workers, even though they have a different role. They're not kind of elevated and alienated from the masses in the way that we see maybe elected representatives now. But even when we're not in a revolutionary moment and we're not thinking about how we can like restructure our social relations, this understanding helps us be clearer in our goals within our struggles. So if we understand that revolution comes when mass struggles overflow the bounds of normal politics, we can see that through struggle outside of an active revolution, workers and communities can see the potential for their collective power. So we're trying to say, how do we get to a place where workers and communities can see and get access to a taste of that collective power? So this changes how we organize towards state reforms and electoral politics. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the rally last night, about Pierre Poilievre. So if we were only concerned about state power, that talk or event would just be about how to elect less bad politicians. But instead, our goal is not simply to defeat Poilievre and the right-wing movement he represents by electing someone else, some less bad oppressor, but by working to strengthen mass movements that will be able to fight right-wing actions of any government. So we heard in Dina Ladd's talk, for example, both in her call, so we heard in Dina Ladd's talk that we need to be talking to our families, our neighbors, our coworkers about the struggles we face and who are the real targets of our struggles if we want to undermine Pierre Poilievre. So he wants to say that the target is migrants, and we are coming to say no, it's the bosses, it's the landlords, it's the billionaires, it's the right-wing politicians, and that work is essential to us being able to organize, regardless of who gets elected, because, we know that whoever is elected is still going to act in the interest of the ruling class. And so what we need to be doing is talking to the people in our communities about the ruling class being the target. And I want to raise something else that Dina said, which is that when she was talking about undocumented people being mobilized around regularization, and then, essentially losing that struggle. But then being prepared to say, we may not have won, but we know that we need to do what we can to support the people who are being targeted now. And what that means is that this is a product of building stronger working class movements. So the target changes or the issue changes, but the movement stays mobilized. And that's what's essential here. So essentially, I want to argue that, or I want to highlight that these actions strengthen our ability to fight or pressure any government or any policy that attempts to take action that will hurt workers and our families. And so we aren't simply organizing for and around elections. We're understanding that elections may offer a way to engage workers in mass movements and organizing beyond and past elections. I think that another thing from last night that I just want to mention is that Ricardo Tranjan was saying that there's a broad consensus about the role of market in housing, and he was like, it's what the Tories believe, it's what the Liberals believe, it's what segments of the NDP and the Bloc believe. And so our work has to be to build a movement where we draw the line between those who want to profit from housing and those who think that people should have a place to live. And so, again, building strong mass movements of workers and tenants will be required to take on landlords and governments regardless of who is elected. In a different context, I'll also say that we see this internationally too, where if you get focused too much on an individual oppressive regime, often an uprising will then fail to kind of reach its revolutionary potential because it can't transform from just targeting the regime to targeting the capitalist state apparatus, and then a new regime comes in that then brings back the interests of the ruling class. Another example that I want to illustrate the example or illustrate the idea that if we don't understand the nature of the state, we will fail to live up to the capacity of a revolutionary moment is in the context of the 2012 Quebec student strike. So obviously there's lots to say about that movement. There's not time to go into all of it, but I just think that it's important. We can see how a struggle over a concrete demand of maintaining the tuition fee freeze boiled over into a more widespread movement related to the government's oppression of protests through Law 78. And then, it seemed like the Charest government capitulated by resigning and calling an election, but they were simply replaced by the Parti Québécois, who then raised tuition fees. And so while there's other kind of limits that we can talk about that movement, including the lack of broad workplace action by workers to escalate the struggle, we can see here that Charest was defeated, but the interests of the ruling class remained. So the interest of the ruling class was still enforced, even though the students were successful in toppling the government, essentially. So all of this is to also, I think it's also just essential that we understand that the state is integrated in all parts of people's lives. And so it's integral to our day-to-day realities. And so if we fail to organize on the kind of those concrete measures that people are dealing with in their day-to-day lives, we won't be able to create the conditions for that revolutionary action. And if we don't understand the context of the state and the limits of fighting for reforms, then we're going to fail to live up to the revolutionary moment when it comes. So you can see the interplay between kind of the reformist demands and also needing to be focused on what is required for revolution. Before opening up the discussion, I do want to just talk about one more aspect of what Lenin is talking about in State and Revolution, and that is the role of the working class. And I think it's especially important from this morning's talk about our conversations about the importance of the rank and file. But Lenin reminds us that the working class are the only class who have the ability to take over the economy and the day-to-day operations of society that people rely on when the state is abolished. So the reason why the working class is so important is because it's workers who understand how to fix the power lines, to run the dialysis machines, to distribute food. And so in the context where if we understand the state is integrated into people's everyday lives, in the context where we're taking on the state, we need to have the power of the people that actually provide for people's everyday needs. And at the same time, workers are also the ones who are best poised to enact pressure against the state. And so to take from Anne Alexander, workers are both rooted in the relations of production and have the ability to become a weapon. And this dual role means that worker action is particularly important in revolutionary activity. And this is a quote from Anne Alexander that I think is really helpful. And she says, "Struggles by workers in their workplaces are exceptionally important to the development of the mass movements of our age. Strikes are not just another kind of protest, but can transform the whole trajectory of the mobilization from below. When workers begin to test their power as workers and not just as angry citizens, this has two effects. Firstly, it reveals workers' own power to themselves. And it also reveals, secondly, it reveals the emerging class forces. In other words, it brings the ruling class into sharp focus and tears the veil of neutrality off the state and its bureaucratic and military institutions." So understanding Lenin's analysis of state and revolution can also help us see the revolutionary potential of organizing in our workplaces. When workers struggle to win concrete demands in their workplaces, this reveals our own power. It engages the ideas that are essential for revolution to occur, that our collective power can and will overthrow the ruling class that oppresses us in their interest. And it reminds workers that we don't share the interests of bosses. So finally, to return to Faiz's concern that our two options are we follow a reformist path and get sucked into the state apparatus, or we engage in struggle, which will surely invite the immense repressive power of the state, the answer is that we actually do both. We engage in reformist initiatives, but stay focused on building towards revolutionary potential. And this allows us to engage in struggles that prepare us for revolutionary moments. And I think I'll just add that in struggling side by side with other workers, we also learn how to work with each other, how to understand our context, how to solve problems collectively, all things that probably when we're in the midst of a revolutionary moment, we're gonna need a lot. And what I've been saying to people as I've been talking about this talk, you don't want to be the first time you're approaching a power worker to be when you need to get the power rehooked up in the working class communities because the state's turned it off. You want to have those relationships existing. You want to know who that, you want to know your fellow workers who can do those things. You don't want to just be yeah, I know my neighbor's a power worker, but I've never talked to him before, whatever, So it seems silly, but it's true. In those revolutionary moments, there's going to be things that we're going to need to talk to each other. And if we haven't talked to each other before, if you're not used to talking to people, who might not share your exact views, then we're not going to be well prepared. So yeah, that was a little over, but Thanks. We'll open it up now.